Hi, I'm Sandra Sadowski of Medievalist.net, and today we're going to talk to Steve Gamester, the producer for Museum Secrets, a series that is airing tomorrow on History Television at 10 p.m. Hi, thank you for coming.
Hi Sandra, thanks for having me.
We're just going to talk a little bit about the series, and I have a couple questions for you. What made you want to create this type of show?
Well, one of the things that was definitely appealing is the scope of it. You know, it's because in each episode we focus on a different museum. There's 6 episodes, and we knew that we couldn't tell the full history of these places because they have, in some cases, millions and millions of artifacts and objects. So we decided we were going to choose 6 objects at each museum and tell a great story on those objects, because the idea is that behind every object is a great story to tell. So it was great because you found yourself looking at a wide variety of history, of everything from dinosaurs 200 million years ago to ancient Egyptian stuff to history of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, right up until the late 20th century. So that's quite a rare thing to have in a television series. As anyone who's made a film or maybe written a book in history knows, you're usually specializing on one story and usually talking about at least a year of your life. So sometimes it can, to focus on one subject can be tough, but this series really had the chance to look at a huge variety of history over a long period of time. So that was very appealing.
It's more all-encompassing.
Exactly, yeah. And the other thing was just really, museums are great. They're fantastic places that personally I've always loved, and they're a lot of fun. And they're, one of the things that we talked about very early on in this series when we were pitching it to History Television is that today I think people are very familiar with the idea that the world's information is online. That's
right.
Google's whole thing. Their goal is to have the world's information online. And museums and libraries were really sort of that version in the pre-digital age. These museums are kind of like the repository of world culture. They have millions of objects and the things that we have deemed to be important or that teach us about history. So it was an appealing place to start if you wanted to do a series for History Television. And of course, objects are powerful. They're our most tangible, aside from people, I suppose, they're our most tangible link to the past, and they give you something concrete that you can begin with, and it can lead to an interesting story. So those were sort of the 2 main reasons. And what we found also was that museums have all this great stuff, but the most frequent thing I would hear from people when they would hear about this series, they'd say, I love the Louvre, I love the Met, but it's so overwhelming. You walk into these places and they go on for miles and miles and miles, and all these galleries. Where do you start? So we thought it would be interesting to do a series that didn't try and cover the entire collection of a museum, because that would be impossible, or be a history of the museum, because that wasn't something we were interested in, but just chose a few of the objects, some iconic and famous, like the Mona Lisa at the Louvre, for instance, some objects that aren't as well known but had a great story behind them, and at least people would get a taste of some of the more interesting objects in the museum, and next time they went, they would know something interesting,
right,
and something with a bit more depth to these objects.
You probably had a lot of fantastic experiences going around to museums all over the world. What were some of those experiences, and did you have a lot of challenges?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, overall the experience was great. I mean, it's as a television project, and the locations are Cairo, London, Paris, Rome, New York. It's a dream in that sense. And the interesting thing is that each one of these museums is a little bit different. Obviously they have differences in their collection, but they also have, each one has its own sort of character. The Egyptian Museum in Cairo really jumps to mind. That one is really interesting because it's really like stepping back in time itself when you walk into that place. Not only because of all the objects, obviously, but it's, they've still got all the old wooden display cases. Wow. Some of the tags are kind of these yellow kind of curled up cards that are written in the original French from 100 years ago. Whereas you go to the Met or the Louvre and you've got, you know, flat screens in some cases, or especially the Natural History Museum in London, which was another museum that we covered. So it's natural history, not as much art, so sometimes more interactive. And so there's a lot of advantages to that in that you're able to communicate information to museum goers in a different way, but they lose some of that kind of charm, whereas the Egyptian Museum, which still feels that way.
It's frozen in time.
Exactly, still has that. And then there were some really wonderful experiences that I'll never forget. For instance, when we were, again, you know, to use Cairo as an example, you know, we often get into these museums when they're empty in order to film. So, you know, I had about 10 minutes alone in the room with King Tut's treasures,
wow.
which is a big thrill. And one of our directors, two of our directors, had the opportunity to be in the Sistine Chapel alone, which, if anyone who's been to the Sistine Chapel knows, it's like being in a mall on Christmas Eve trying to get your shopping done, because it's absolutely packed and lots of noise. And for that particular case, we actually, because our focus for that story was on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and specifically, how did Michelangelo do it? In fact, it was exactly 500 years ago from right now he was up there doing this. He painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel from 1508 to 1512. So exactly 500 years ago. It took him 4 years. He's, I think it's something like 60 feet up on rickety wooden scaffolding, his neck curled up trying to paint, and of course he does a masterpiece. He had help. He didn't do it alone. He had people who helped him, but obviously, if anyone who knows who's tried to paint their kitchen ceiling, painting above your head is not easy.
It's not easy.
So we really wanted to give the television audience a sense of that, of what it would be like to be right up underneath this ceiling. So we arranged with the Vatican museums to allow us to build a scaffolding, and our directors, Robert and Rebecca, are some of the few people in the world since Michelangelo to be literally feet away from the top of the ceiling. So those types of experiences were completely unique, and it's an enormous privilege to have.
Do you have a favorite one in particular? A moment where you were just, wow.
Yeah, well, certainly the King Tut, being in the room with King Tut's treasures were a big deal. Another really nice moment actually happened here in Toronto, because one of the museums we covered was the Louvre, which is quite an interesting museum, because it's one of the few in the world that is both world culture and natural history. And if you think about it, they have dinosaurs and they have paintings at the Louvre, and that's quite unique. Usually museums are one or the other. And one of the objects we look at the Louvre is a headdress, a Sioux headdress, that is believed to maybe have belonged to Sitting Bull. It was the great Sioux chief who defeated General Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. And so, you know, really this artifact is one of the most significant in North American history. But they don't know for sure if it was his. The provenance of exactly how it made it to the Louvre is, there's a few gaps along the way, which is often the case with artifacts. It's, you know, you attempt to prove whether or not they are what they're reputed to be. But since there's no scientific or documentation that is completely conclusive that links this headdress to Sitting Bull, we decided we would try something different. And we contacted one of Sitting Bull's descendants, his great-great-grandson, who lives in the Dakotas. His name's Ernie LaPointe. And he had just finished a book about his famous ancestor, sort of telling the Sioux version of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, because of course we know the popular version that's
textbook version.
Exactly. So it was sort of interesting to get his perspective on that story. But also, there's a Sioux belief that the spirits of people exists or can be felt in the objects that once belonged to them. So we flew Arnie to Toronto, and he, for the first time, he'd never laid eyes on this thing. We brought him into a room with the curator who looks after the object, And we had him conduct a ceremony to try and determine whether or not he could feel the presence of his ancestor Sitting Bull in this headdress. So getting to meet the great-grandson of Sitting Bull, Ernie, was a really unique
Connects history.
experience. Yeah, and it's, you know, you've got the object, which gives you this tangible emotional connection, but then you also have a person. And that's something we really tried to do in this series. We always tried to have people who had a connection to these objects, and Ernie was certainly one of those. But I'm not going to tell you have to watch the show
No,
to see
definitely.
if you felt the presence.
This show airs tomorrow at 10 p.m. on History Television in Canada. When will international viewers be able to see it?
Well, it's a good question. The best I can do to answer that one is you'll have to stay tuned, because we have a distributor, BBC Worldwide, which, you know, for documentaries is great, and they will be distributing the series all over the world. But we don't have specific air dates yet in all those countries as to when it's going to air. But you could always go to museumsecrets.tv or through Medievalists, and we can update you and keep people up to date on when it's going to air.
Go overseas.
In their part of the world.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. And tomorrow the show airs January 6th at 10 p.m. on History Television, Museum Secrets. Great show. Watch it. Thank you very much.